Everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy, psychologist, attorney, and educator, and we're going to quickly look at some religious history that is often overlooked when individuals are discussing the history of Africa, the history of Europe, and the history of America, and also the history of the slave trade. And so we're going to look at some history in Africa that is not frequently acknowledged, and it is primarily related to the history of Christianity. There's a belief by many people that Christianity came out of Rome and then somehow made its way to West Africa and then spread across from there. But that narrative is not actually historically accurate. And so we're going to look at how Christianity started in Africa and how it spread, but then how it went out of Africa and then came back into Africa through the West, and how those were different types of Christianity. And to do this, we're going to focus primarily on Ethiopia. If this video appears on anything other than Dr. Tracy McCarthy, it is stolen and unauthorized. Let's get started. One thing that's interesting about messianic depictions is that individuals and cultures tend to have messianic depictions that look like the actual people. And so many people are used to seeing depictions coming out of Europe. But one thing you'll note is that depictions in Africa, in Ethiopia, we're talking about East Africa here, the depictions tend to look like the individuals who are in that particular land space. Many may not be familiar with the St. Catherine Monastery. It's actually located in Africa, and it is the oldest Christian monastery in functional use in the entire world. Now, this monastery sits at the base of Mount Horeb, and one thing that's really interesting about it is that this is where Moses was said to receive the tablets of the law. And this place, this site on which it is located, it is considered sacred to Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And here you can see East African clergy. One thing that happens when individuals think about Africa, they are often encouraged to only think about traditional African religions or to think about Islam in terms of Africa and what is rooted in Africa. One thing that many individuals might not know is that monastic life was integral to early Christianity in Africa. And of course, we're talking about East Africa. And this spiritual life practice was instrumental in those adherents remaining focused on God and not being distracted by the many social and political cares of the world. And so you can see clerics here on the screen to get an idea of what was going on spiritually in Africa in early times and what you have going on even now that many people around the world are not aware of. And here you have additional depictions of individuals understood in the East as Christians. What's interesting is the variation in terms of headdress. And you even see to the left an individual clergy who is wearing a fez. And again, this is East Africa, and so it's something that many people don't talk about or study when they are thinking about Christianity. And here you see additional East African individuals engaged in that monastic life. Many people don't recognize the importance of Ethiopia in terms of Christian history. And one thing to remember is that in addition to what is known as Egypt, that which is known as Ethiopia featured prominently in the history of the early Christian church. So accordingly, many Christian monks existed and continue to exist in Ethiopia. And again, this is something that is not talked about, and many people just simply don't know it. Part of the history of Christianity in East Africa involves a narrative whereby the Romans came into Ethiopia and demanded that the clerics, the bishops, give up their scripture. They had what was considered the early scriptures, and they still do have them. And they were given a choice of persecution, and many of them chose persecution over giving up the scriptures. Again, these were original scriptures they had, and so they chose to run into the wilderness. Now, there is a famous place in Ethiopia that houses many of the religious figures in Ethiopia in terms of Eastern Christianity, and they are sitting atop a mountain, and that is their monastery. And you can only get up by rope, so it's not a place that you can just go to and visit if you would like to, and there are only men there also. And they spend a significant amount of time in study and prayer. And you can see the little cubbies inside of the area there where the individuals actually can sit and study and read. Also noteworthy is that Ethiopia is home to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and it's one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. And here you can see the clergy on the mountain. And here you can see a display of some of the readings that they have housed on the mountain. And here you see another depiction of clergy, and this individual again is wearing a headdress that is very similar to what would be considered a fez, but actually sort of branching out in a different kind of direction. And here you get to see also additional Christian clergy on top of the mountain in Ethiopia. And here you can see a depiction of Debre Damu. This is that mountain monastery there. And this ancient monastery at Debre Damu, it remains the oldest Christian church standing in Ethiopia right now. And it sits on top of a very high plateau situated north of what is known as Aksum. And Aksum is located in the northern region of Ethiopia, and it was an ancient African kingdom that was known for extreme wealth and learning. And the narrative also indicates that this particular space was relevant to the Queen of Sheba and Solomon. And there was the assertion that, according to Ethiopian tradition, that the Ark of the Covenant rests in this area and remains under the watchful guard of a Christian priest. And here you get to see clergy on top of that plateau, and you get to see someone actually climbing up the plateau to gain entry into the area there. It's very restricted, and you can only come up by this rope. And here you can see a visitor being given some assistance to make the rest of that climb. And here you can see clergy actually reading scripture at Debre Damu. Again, you can see it's large, and this is very old. They have the old scriptures there. Now, it's important to remember that the clergy actually live their lives on this plateau, and so they actually live and die on this plateau. When people tend to think about the church diaspora, they tend to think about the diaspora coming out of Rome and then spreading out. But what people may not know is that there is an actual African church diaspora, and Ethiopian clerics have been at home in Jerusalem for over a century. And here is another depiction of that. Another notation related to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is that it has been the dominant spiritual force and political force in Ethiopia for the past 17 centuries. And what has resulted has been this dynamic whereby you have a mixture of ancient African cults and Christian doctrine in that area. Now, there is often talk about having a pope from Africa, and what many don't realize is that there have already been 3 popes that came from Africa. So you have one in 189 through 198 AD, then one from 311 to 314 AD, and then another from 492 to 496 AD. And according to the USA Today, North Africa was considered the actual Bible Belt of early Christianity, with Carthage being the buckle. And when we look at Pope Victor I, we see that he served from 189 to 199, and Pope Victor was an African native, and he was the first pope to celebrate Mass in Latin versus Greek, and he died, it was speculated, from martyrdom. And here you can see Miltiades, and what you see down at the bottom, if you look closely, you see a fair, and remember, a fair is the name for Africa. And then we also have Galatius, and he was reputed for his focus on justice, learning, charity, and holiness. Again, if you look down at the bottom, off to the right, you'll see a fair again. And so many people are confused about the early name for Africa or what Africa was called. But this is also consistent with the communication that went to King Charles related to the early name of Africa being a fair, which means hidden, concealed, cloaked. Now, of course, in addition to Ethiopia, you have Egypt in terms of being that base for the Coptic Church of Africa, and this dates to the origin of Christianity. And Copts assert that their church was founded by the Apostle Mark in Alexandria in 57 AD. Many people are unaware of the fact that there are multiple popes, and so you also have the African Coptic Pope, and Pope is father basically, and so you have Pope Shenouda. This is Pope Shenouda III for the African Coptic papacy. Now, what is interesting to note about Africa, both East and West, is this confederation of those individuals understood as operating under the Abrahamic faiths. And so you have justifications being given for slavery from those who are understood as both Christian and Islamic, and often, again, working in concert. And here you can see another depiction of individuals understood as Islamic or Moors involved in the slave trade in Africa. And the slave trade, many people don't understand this, but the bulk of the slave trade was going on in Africa in the east, and so there was a major point of departure from the east, going further east, and then going from the east to the west. And again, you have this justification for slavery coming from all of those religions under the Abrahamic umbrella. So you see here a notation that says the slavery of the quote-unquote heathen races was sanctioned by the divine law of the Old Testament, and the system of Roman slavery was allowed to Christians by the apostles in the New Testament, and it was regarded as a providential arrangement of society by the fathers, the councils, the theologians, and all of the commentators in every branch of the church for more than 18 centuries. And so you can see here this justification for what individuals know is inherently wrong. They know that slavery is wrong, but they come up with a justification for it because it really ties into their own selfish need to do what they want to do versus what natural law dictates. Now again, what you have going on is you have individuals from the East moving people to the West in terms of Africa for enslavement. But you also have this dynamic, and those individuals tend to be from the Islamic faith. Then you have on the west side of Africa a dynamic whereby the European Christian church entered and participated in the enslavement process, and also in a process of colonization based upon religion. And so you had these religious groups competing for control in West Africa. So not only in control of the natural resources of West Africa, but also in control of the people. And whenever religion has been used to justify colonization, it's always been used as a divine imperative. That's been the argument, that there is a divine imperative to engage in this behavior. And what's interesting is the dynamic of phenotype and how it changed from the phenotype of the spiritual representation in East Africa to the phenotype of the spiritual representation in West Africa. And again, you have the Christianity that's coming out of East Africa, slowly moving west, not quite fast enough apparently. And then you have the Christianity that is coming from Europe. Now, of course, this is Christianity that came out of Africa, went up into Europe, and then came back down into Africa on the west coast. When talking about the religions of the world and how they have oftentimes actually come together to work together for a variety of ends, it's important to make note of the history of Christianity in Africa and how there is this dichotomous history. And so it's not the same history across Africa. And then it's also important to understand the role of Africans in the European leadership in terms of the Catholic Church. And so that's often overlooked, and it's often overlooked that there have been multiple popes coming out of Africa, and that there are actual popes in East Africa that are distinct from the pope in Europe. And it's also important to, when people are talking about truth commission types of dynamics and getting to the root of the truth of the transatlantic slave trade and the slavery that took place in Africa and then in Europe, so there was this integrated process going on, it's important for people to get a handle on the role of the different religions in perpetuating this human rights violation. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care.